from Minnesota's Weather Authority.
5 Eyewitness News presents Debate Night in Minnesota.
Welcome back to Debate Night in Minnesota. Live from St. Paul College, I'm Lindsey Brown. Governor Tim Walz declined our multiple invitations to debate tonight. Walz, the DFL incumbent, is just wrapping up his first term as governor. Before that, Walz served 6 terms in Congress. He was also a school teacher and National Guard member. Dr. Scott Jensen is battling to be the first Republican Minnesota governor in more than a decade. Dr. Jensen is the founder of Catalyst Medical Clinic in Chaska and Watertown and a former University of Minnesota associate professor. He served in the state Senate from 2017 to 2021 and was a Waconia school board member. Our final exchange tonight is a question and answer session with Dr. Scott Jensen, the Republican running for Minnesota governor. Now, this is how tonight's Q&A is going to work. We're going to give Dr. Scott Jensen a 30-second opening statement. Following that, 5 Eyewitness News chief political reporter Tom Hauser, ABC 6 News anchor Laura Lee, and MinnPost State Government reporter Peter Callahan will be asking Dr. Jensen questions covering a variety of issues. He'll then get up to a minute and a half to answer. Our panel may then ask a follow-up question. If they do, Dr. Jensen will then again get up to another minute and a half to answer. We will end our question and answer session by giving Dr. Jensen the opportunity to provide a minute-long closing statement. All right, now for our opening statement from Dr. Scott Jensen. Dr. Jensen, you have 30 seconds to explain why the people of Minnesota should vote for you governor of Minnesota.
I became a family doctor to help people. I'm running for governor because Tim Walz is hurting people. In his inaugural address, he promised to unite Minnesota. He lied. He failed us. He divided us. He did not lead. Minnesota called out, "Where is our governor?" He was absent. He blamed others, locking down businesses, locking in the elderly, locking out kids. Tim Walz hurt people. He failed to lead. I'm running because I will lead, and we will have safer streets, and we will get a sizzling economy, and we'll take care of our kids. And in doing all those things, we're going to heal Minnesota.
Dr. Jensen, thank you. Our 3 panelists are back to ask Dr. Jensen tonight's questions. 5 Eyewitness News chief political reporter Tom Hauser is starting us off.
And Senator Jensen, thank you very much for being here. The governor and legislature could not agree on final passage of a budget bill last spring that included $4 billion in tax cuts along with new spending on things like public safety. You urged your fellow Republicans to reject that deal in the Senate. Why did you oppose that bill and ultimately leave those tax cuts on the table?
We wouldn't be asking this question if Tim Walz had done his job. When you let the legislature meet for 5 months and don't get serious about doing something, this is what happens. This is on Tim Walz. Basically, there was $12 billion they were talking about, and they were talking about having $4 billion in additional spending, $4 billion in tax relief, and $4 billion left on the line. The problem was they'd already increased the budget from $47 billion to $52 billion. We had a 75% increase in our general fund budget in little more than a decade. That's the largest chunk of money increase in the history of the state of Minnesota, from 47 to 52 or 53 billion. Tim Walz wanted to spend $3 or $4 billion more. Had he been willing to simply do the tax relief, it would have gone through. Had he been willing to do the bonding bill, it would have gone through. But he wanted more spending, and that was a problem. From my perspective, I thought that Tim Walz was literally trying to increase spending to a 17% increased budget, and that's just not acceptable. So actually, who stopped the legislative session was Tim Walz, because on a hot mic, his chairman of the House committee whispered to Senator Kiffmeyer, the governor called, or something to that effect. The governor called, and we're not going to be able to go along with what we'd already negotiated because he doesn't want to do it. So this was shut down by Tim Walz, and Tim Walz had a chance to anywhere along the line call a special session if he wanted to.
Was part of your opposition to that bill a political calculation that perhaps Republicans would take the House and Senate, perhaps you would win election, and that you would get greater tax cuts, or you'd be able to shape it more to your liking, even though you left billions in tax cuts on the table?
At that point in time, my concern was just an unsustainable biennial general fund budget increase. We were looking at going from 10% to almost 17% increase in the budget. I feel that's irresponsible. It's unsustainable. We had not taken care of the real business. Right off the bat, they should have gotten rid of taxing Social Security twice. That should have been done in a standalone bill. Instead, it was always, if you will, political trade bait. And this is what goes on all the time. And Tim Walz is a master at it. So from my perspective, I think my motives are pretty clean. I just did not want more spending. I felt like if Tim Walz would let us do something standalone, a bonding bill, it'll go through. Tax relief bill, it'll go through. But if you're going to connect it to more spending, it shouldn't go through. And the Republicans in the House said that. There were even some Democrats who were uncomfortable with what Tim Walz was trying to do. And certainly the Senate Republicans stopped that cold in its tracks.
Just 25 seconds left. Were you concerned at all about the fact that additional public safety money would now be stalled as a result of this?
I was concerned that Tim Walz was playing games, and a significant portion of that money that he was saying for public safety was actually not going to the police. If we're going to fix public safety, it has to be about the cops. We've got to put more cops on the street. We've got to fund them. We've got to quit playing games. We're saying, well, we're going to have community people that aren't armed. If you have community people and you say, well, these are going to walk the street and they're going to somehow help, I think we're kidding ourselves.
All right, our next question is with ABC 6 News anchor Laura Lee.
Senator, the $250 million fraud investigation into Feeding Our Future has made headlines across the country. You have been vocal in attacking Governor Walz and his administration. What evidence do you have that his administration could have done more, given that they did tip off the FBI they had suspicious fraud that was happening?
Actually, if you look at the timeline, the governor broke the law. If you look at the statute, he has an obligation to report to the Office of the Legislative Auditor if it is suspected that fraud may be occurring. Tim Walz hasn't been willing to meet with the press, I don't think, and go through the timeline. He certainly hasn't told Minnesota. What did he learn and when did he learn it? He said a couple weeks ago he learned it in April of 2020. Then his office called the news report and said, well, actually, it was the summer of 2020. Governor Walz misspoke. Then they called back again and said, well, it's actually November. But you know what? It doesn't matter when he learned of it. Any one of those 3 dates would constitute a violation of the law because they didn't notify the Office of the Legislative Auditor. And letters clearly indicate that from Judy Randall, who's in charge of the OLA. So without question, Tim Walz broke the law. We know that he tried to blame it on anybody and everybody. He said, well, we need to investigate the judge's decision. Then he said, well, the FBI made us keep paying these tens and tens of millions of dollars. And then he even went so far as to say, well, the United States Department of Agriculture set up a program without the normal constraints on it. And so, in part, it was the structure of the program. Tim Walz broke the law, didn't do his job, tried to get it swept under the rug, is covering something up. He didn't tell us when he learned about it, and in the end, Minnesota lost $250 million. And if I could say this, I would say this. Tim Walz the other night in Rochester said, you get what you pay for. Well, not under the Tim Walz administration, because under Tim Walz, we paid for 125 million meals that never got paid for. So with Tim Walz, you don't get what you pay for.
To follow up what you were talking about with the timeline, and you mentioned a little bit about the judges, there's proof of the transcripts that says they were ordered to do so. What can you say about that?
Excuse me, the transfer ordered?
The transcripts in court from the judge saying that they were ordered to keep paying.
No, there was no order that they had to continue paying. That's not true. There was conversation in the courtroom where the judge spoke, and that's not uncommon. But in terms of a judge ordering, the judge did not order Governor Walz to continue paying. That was not true at all.
Peter, you had a follow-up.
If I could just follow up a little bit on the statute that you cite referring to the Office of Legislative Auditor. The same statute says there's an exception for when administration does not or should not notify the Office of Legislative Auditor, and that is when it could put at risk an ongoing investigation, which seems to be the case here. So did they really violate this statute if there was an exception to that statute?
The investigation hadn't begun at that time, Peter.
The
It says, you're saying that there's an exception in the statute if there's an investigation underway. Tim Walz and his team didn't have any investigation going on. They were being sued by Feeding Our Futures in regards to delay in processing the applications. They didn't sue back. They didn't do anything. They just walked away from it. But at the time that they did not report it to the OL, there was no investigation going on the part of the state.
There was no investigation on the part of the state, but they knew an investigation would be taken. They would be talking to the federal government and the FBI about this fraud.
Peter, I don't know how they would know that they were going to be talking to the FBI, because if they're going to be talking to the FBI, I think they would talk to the FBI, but they didn't. That wasn't until the next year.
All right, we stay there with Peter Callahan for the next question. This one focusing on crime and public safety.
You talked earlier about your proposal on criminal justice and crime problems, but is hiring more police really the only way to reduce crime in the cities and the suburbs and the state? Or does that just react to what's going on at that very moment? In other words, would you consider any ideas that might help get to young people early, keep them out of trouble? Are there some ways that even from Democrats that you could see wisdom in trying to reach out to communities like that?
I don't think there's any question that in order to get public safety restored, this is going to have to be a multi-pronged approach. Tim Walz said the other night, and he'd be able to, if we didn't have an empty podium, he could maybe respond for himself, and then we could see his wonderful smile, right? But he's not here tonight. Bottom line is, he said the other night, there should be a heavy cost for criminals. There hasn't been a heavy cost for criminals. Whether you're talking about his Department of Corrections, whether you're talking about the judges, whether you're talking about the no cash bail, there has not been a heavy cost for criminals. We have repeat violent felons back on the streets over and over again. I think what we need to do is a multi-pronged approach. We need to have more cops on the street. No question. 2 or 3 times what we have right now. We need to have restorative justice in place. We need to use incarceration as a tool for deterrence. You cannot do it any other way. And we must understand that a mandated minimum sentence means a mandated minimum sentence. But we need to enforce the law. If we don't enforce the law, then we're not going to be able to, Peter, rehab some of those people. Right now, we've got carjacking, which wasn't even tracked until Tim Walz became governor. And I think in 2021, we had almost 800 carjackings. The really alarming thing is the majority of these carjackings are being committed by people under the age of 20. In many situations, under the age of 17. There's probably reasons for that. But we're not simply dealing with some hardened criminals out there. We're dealing with a whole generation that's being raised in a culture of violent crime and recurrent, if you will, criminal actions. What are these 16-year-olds going to be doing when they're 26? What is the likelihood that we could possibly get our arms around this unless we get serious about this? Tim Walz has said that he's proud of Minnesota's response when he talked about the riots. He doesn't seem to, at any level, say, the buck stops at my desk. There has been nothing substantive done. That's why the Minnesota Police and Peace Officers Association came out and endorsed me unanimously.
I apologize to interrupt. We are out of time. Peter, do you have a follow-up to that question?
Just to say that sounds like you do think there are ways other than just increasing policing and sentencing. You talked about restorative justice.
Peter, you're absolutely right. There are many things we have to do, and there are experts in the field far more knowledgeable on it than I am. But I do know this. The other piece that we need to not ignore is mental health, because an awful lot of these young people do suffer from mental health things. So I appreciate your question and bringing it up, Peter, because this has got to be a bipartisan, multi-pronged approach if we really want to get serious about getting safety back on our streets.
Tom Hauser with the next question.
Senator, let's talk about abortion. You've acknowledged you changed your position from opposing almost all abortions, including in cases of rape or incest, to now allowing exceptions for rape, incest, or to protect the life of the mother. Is that an evolution in your thinking on this issue, or was it a realization that your previous position was politically unpopular?
It's an evolution of thinking. I don't think there's any question that when Roe v. Wade was overturned, everybody sort of pressed pause and said, I need to think about this. What we need to realize without question is that abortion's not on the ballot in November because in Minnesota, Doe v. Gomez in 1995 indicates that it's a clearly protected constitutional right for all women. As a pro-life physician who's had the privilege of delivering 500 kids, I think this is an opportunity for me to be a leader, to support women and say, let's do all that we can to support and protect women. Let's have birth control pills over the counter with a maximum price of $10 per month. Let's have paid maternity leave in place. Let's streamline adoption and provide tax credits with it. Let's have stiffer penalties for crimes that target women, such as rape and carjacking. We can do all those things. But in regards to what's on the ballot in November, I think it's clear that Tim Walz is trying to tell the voter, you don't realize that this is the thing. Tim Walz, Keith Ellison, they've both said no governor can change the law of Minnesota. The Supreme Court has spoken. This is a constitutional right. What's on the ballot, without question, is skyrocketing inflation, relentless lawlessness on the streets, and a loss of public safety. Our kids are being injured. They're not learning. If you will, achievement gaps are growing. These are the things that are on the ballot. But I understand that this is the only issue that Tim Walz is running on.
Will you acknowledge, as your opponent does and some of your critics do, that a governor can have an impact on laws around abortion, even though it is protected in the Constitution? You can have an impact on public funding. You can have an impact on appointing Supreme Court justices who might have a different view of abortion. Will you at least acknowledge those things?
I acknowledge absolutely that the composition of the Supreme Court could change. There's only one Supreme Court justice scheduled to go off by aging in the next 4 years, and he is one of the two conservatives on a 5-2 liberal court, which is arguably more liberal than the 1995 court. I will absolutely acknowledge that. But I would also say this, that no governor can provide a ban on abortion, and I'm not running to do that. As far as I'm concerned, we have the law of the land in place, and as governor, I have the obligation to protect and defend all laws in Minnesota, including the constitutionally protected right of a woman to access abortion. If this changes during my watch, it'll be through a constitutional ballot, and I would have one vote, just as each of the 201 legislators would have one vote. This will be decided by 4 million Minnesotans. That's what the Roe v. Wade overturning did. It put it back to the states, and in my view, Minnesota should decide.
If you're elected governor, would you push for a constitutional amendment to put it to a vote of Minnesotans?
I would not. I'm running because I want to control inflation. I want to restore public safety. I think our system is broken. We need to protect our kids.
Laura Lee with the next question.
There remains a political and economic divide between regions of the state like Greater Minnesota versus the metro area. Political campaigns often make that divide worse, not better. What would you do to close that divide?
We need to let miners mine. We need to let loggers log. We need to let farmers farm. We need to understand that if you want the land stewarded well, the people who steward the land best are those who live on it, who raise their kids on it, who want their grandchildren raised on it. This idea of, if you will, paralyzing an economy in a given part of the state is absolutely ludicrous. We've been mining in northern Minnesota for more than 100 years and done it responsibly. We have 95% of the nation's nickel reserves up there. We desperately need those nickel metals mined. You might have seen recently that Tim Walz made some comment about going up and we making one of the biggest investments in U.S. steel. That wasn't that wasn't to Tim Walz. He didn't make any investment. That was a private investment of over $100 million by U.S. Steel. Tim Walz just went up to run a victory lap on something he didn't earn. But the bottom line is there is so much available to us, and we need it. The nation needs it for batteries and all the things that are going to allow us to, if you will, have a positive impact on taking care of our atmosphere and our environment. We absolutely can mine safely. I think that Joe Biden just came out now recently and said that he was going to provide money support for North Dakota to be processing the nickel that's going to be mined in Minnesota. How upside down is that? So we're going to mine the nickel in Minnesota if we can ever get this through, and then we're going to, by rail, move it over to North Dakota and have it processed there because North Dakota's getting that contract, not Minnesota. Does science stop at the border? Is that what's happening? North Dakota doesn't realize what we realize? I'm not buying that.
Laura, do you have a follow-up?
No.
All right, our next question is Peter Callahan.
Thank you. Senator, you've been critical of the state and nation's COVID response, including the vaccination requirements, masking mandates, questioning how COVID deaths were reported on death certificates, even recently likening state COVID guidelines to what the Nazis did to Jews at Kristallnacht. So I'm curious, if you're elected, you could face a similar public health crisis, polio reemerging, or a new infectious disease. I'm curious as to how you would respond to such a crisis. Would vaccinations be part of a public health response?
I spend $250,000 every year purchasing vaccines for my patients. I am vaccinated to the level I would like to be, and that's considered for the most part fully vaccinated. My children have been as well. We'll provide over 1,000 doses of influenza vaccine this year through our clinics. But let me make it very clear. In regards to COVID-19 vaccine and the fact that the CDC has put this on the immunization schedule for kids, in Minnesota, as governor, there will be no mandate for children to have COVID-19 vaccines in order for them to attend school or to go to daycare. And I don't care if you're talking about public schools, private schools, or home schools. There will be no mandate. This is wrong. We have to have parental rights. We have seen this vaccination program ramp through so rapidly. And the two things that people were always focused on, safety and efficacy, both have challenging questions in front of them. You might say that the VAERS program and the side effects that have been reported aren't as meaningful as they were for other vaccination programs. You might say that, and that's fine. But the fact is the CDC itself has said that some 5,000 to 10,000 deaths have occurred within 48 hours of people receiving the vaccine. In 1976, when Jerry Ford got the swine flu vaccine, there were 55 deaths or thereabouts, and that was enough to stop the program. And the efficacy of this vaccine in terms of stopping hospitalizations, stopping death, and stopping transmission is woefully inadequate. We don't have that evidence. And Peter, in terms of the death certificates, the thing that initially propelled me, I guess, to the front of the line, I think it's been clearly established that we were seeing the cause of death put on death certificates as COVID when clearly it wasn't. There were people dying of stage 4 colon cancer on hospice, and they were being put down as COVID. We know that was happening. So as far as I'm concerned, I didn't have it all right, but I had an awful lot of it right.
So are you saying that there should be no vaccine requirements for children in public schools, or just that COVID should not be added to that?
In the last few days, COVID-19 was added to the pediatric immunization schedule by the CDC. And I'm saying that in Minnesota, as governor, that will not have an impact. We will not be following the CDC guidelines under my watch.
But why wouldn't parents have a right to reject those vaccines as well and still attend public schools?
Amen. Thank you, Peter.
Why? No, why?
People are discussing this across the country. Parents are very concerned.
I'm not talking about COVID-19 vaccines. I'm talking about the others that are required in this state. Why wouldn't parents have a right to reject those vaccines as well, measles, DPT?
Parents should have the right to decide which vaccinations their kids get.
And still attend public schools.
And still attend public schools.
So all the lists, all the vaccines that are required in this state should be voluntary.
Right now, we have exemptions available. We have exemptions based on conscientious or religious, and in some situations we have medical exemptions. I'm speaking specifically to the COVID-19 vaccination approval by the CDC. That will not change anything in Minnesota. Parents can rest assured that if I'm governor, I will not allow a COVID-19 mandated program in order for the kids to attend school. And I think Minnesotans deserve to know, what would Tim Walz do? What is Tim Walz's position on this? Is he going to tell parents that their kids can't go to school if they don't get COVID-19 vaccinations? And it looks like it may be 3 different shots. That's the way it looks. It was difficult to determine exactly what the CDC was recommending. So I think, really, Tim Walz should come out and tell Minnesotans what he would do.
Tom Hauser, next question.
Senator, you released last week a 10-point plan for economic prosperity on the Iron Range, including many initiatives to promote the mining and timber industries. There wasn't much in the plan by way of addressing any environmental impacts of that. What is your plan for safely expanding those industries?
We can safely expand both mining and logging. These industries have been permitted to death. I think PolyMet has 20 years of work and almost 20 years and $500 million, and they don't have a shovel in the ground. I think that what you're seeing is political gamesmanship continuously smothering and undercutting the economy of the North. I think you see various political candidates running up to the northern part of the state saying, oh yeah, we'll support you here, we'll support you here, and then they don't. This is horrific what's happened to the northern part of the state. I used to have the opportunity to take care of patients. I used to moonlight at Aurora White Memorial Hospital, and I would see these miners, and they're not asking for anything special. They want to be able to take care of their families and pay the bills and have a roof over their head. I think that our 10-point plan lays out a multitude of things that could happen. Certainly increasing investment, making certain that people that live and grow up in these greater Minnesota communities, especially in the north and in the south where I grew up in Sleepy in regards to agribusiness, we need to make certain that the young people are encouraged to stay in these communities, that there's plenty of opportunities. Our 10-point plan listed that. I think it also listed, if you will, some various tax credit programs. But there's so much we could be doing.
But you will insist on environmental protections in any of these expansions?
Absolutely. And we've demonstrated that we can mine safely and we can continue to have the environmental protections. But I think it's one thing to have environmental protections. It's another thing to play that legal game where there's always one more lawsuit around the corner.
Thank you, Senator.
Laura Lee with the next question, and this one involves taxes.
Senator, you have talked about scrapping the state's income tax system and moving towards something entirely new for Minnesota, but similar to what other states do where they rely on more of the sales tax. What do you have in mind and why?
The other day in the Star Tribune, there was an article that said, Jensen's tax proposal has big questions associated with it or something like that. You're darn right it has big questions associated with it. It's a big idea. Rudy Perpich, as a Democratic governor in the 1980s, took the same kind of heat, if you will, from the media and from his colleagues when he spoke to the issue of having open enrollment and post-secondary enrollment options. Those were big ideas that got passed, and they changed the way we do education. This is why campaigns are so pedestrian, so unimaginative, because we don't have the big conversations. First thing we should do is stop taxing Social Security twice. That's unconscionable. That should have been fixed a long time ago. But we, with a $10 to $12 billion surplus, should have that big conversation. How could Minnesota get there? Can we get there? Can we? One plan that I've seen that would work from a spreadsheet perspective is if we would cut our spending 10% the first year and then cap it for the next 3 and use the $10 billion surplus to backfill. In 4 years, we could have reduced every one of our 4 tax brackets by 50%. We would be halfway there. We could then press pause and say, okay, can we get the rest of the way there or not? But if we don't have the conversation, we'll never know. This isn't about increasing a sales tax. This isn't about taking more here. This is about looking at all the options. How much income would we get from increased corporate activity? How much income will we get from the inflation of revenues if we cap our spending? There's a variety of things we could do, but if we don't have those hard conversations, those big conversations where we unleash people who have true expertise in this area, we will never know if we could become one of those 20% of states that do this. How did Tennessee do it? If we want to become the economic hub of the Midwest, we're going to have to be willing to have big conversations, and we're not doing it.
We've hit our time, Laura.
Follow-up question. Do you plan to end the sales tax exemptions on clothing?
No, I have no plans to end any sales tax. I want to talk about all the options. If you look at where we get our income in Minnesota, we have about 12 different tax sources that we get them from. Sales tax is one, personal income tax is one, corporate income tax. But if you actually look at the list, the question would be, is there a way that through increased corporate activity, having Fortune 500 companies come to Minnesota, bringing in more revenue that way, good paying jobs, and holding spending down. Can we get there when you have a $10 to $12 billion surplus in place that you could use to backfill while you're getting there? If we can't get all the way there, okay, but can't we at least try? Can't we at least have that big conversation?
Thank you, Senator.
All right, thank you, everyone. And this wraps up our Q&A session with Dr. Scott Jensen. Dr. Jensen, we want to give you time, another minute actually, to speak directly to the people of Minnesota about why they should vote for you.
Well, thank you. This is a big deal. If I didn't show up at the office, would my patients think that I had abandoned them? I mean, Tim Walz didn't show up tonight. He has a very clear strategy. They're basically saying if we hunker down and don't say anything and don't let the media have at us, we won't say anything stupid, and we can have this media machine and our money run us over the goal line. Gee, I hope that Minnesotans are alert to that. We have endured some incredibly trying times as a state. We felt heartbreaks from seeing lives turned upside down. But we have to ask the question, who's going to step forward? Who's going to help Minnesota find a path back? How can we restore our rights? How can we once again be that state that leads in education? How can we get public safety back on the streets? How can we really support the work that cops do? How can we elevate teachers? How can we make sure that our kids are getting the education that we need them to get? How can we stop this inflationary cycle? How can we stop the Tim Walz plan to make Minnesota more and more energy dependent? There's so many things we can do. I'm asking this time around, Minnesotans, this is a huge decision we have to make. We can do so much better. This is an election about hearts and minds. This is an election about everyday heroes. We need every one of you to step forward. Because if you step forward and support Scott Jensen and Matt Birk, we have a chance to heal Minnesota. We have a chance to have safer streets. We can control inflation, and we can absolutely elevate our children's achievements. Thank you.
Dr. Jensen, thank you so much. And that concludes our time with Republican candidate for governor, Dr. Scott Jensen. Dr. Jensen, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Still ahead tonight, analysis from our two debates and from our Q&A with Dr. Jensen. We'll be joined by Carleton College political analyst Stephen Scheer, who will discuss what you've just heard with 5 Eyewitness News' Tom Hauser and ABC 6 News' Laura Lee. But first,